Last week, I provided my defense of free will in the Bible, also known as libertarian free will, talked about why I use that modifier of libertarianism. And many people who support the idea of determinism, which denies free will come along and say that there are other passages that show that free will in the Bible is only the appearance of free will. As Millard Erickson, one of the defenders of the view of determinism, wrote, "We may define the plan of God as his eternal decision, rendering certain all things which shall come to pass." So, in other words, God plans what our actions and decisions and thoughts are. What we do in life is certain before we ever do it, based upon the plan of God. Determinists base their view upon two things, one, philosophy, and two, scripture. I believe the philosophical argument is more important because, as we will see, the scriptural passages that are used to support the idea of determinism never actually say that God determines all things. The philosophical argument, at least what we have time for this morning, there are more arguments than this, but this is the primary one that we would have time for in a lesson like this. The philosophical argument is based on God's foreknowledge or omniscience. The supporters of determinism feel so strongly regarding the link of God's omniscience to his determination of all things that famous advocates of this view, such as R.C. Sproul and Steve Lawson, will say that Christians who deny meticulous determinism, who believe that God decrees everything, that if you deny that, you are an atheist. They would say that I'm teaching atheism in this series. I bring this up simply to illustrate how strongly they believe the link is between God's foreknowledge and the concept of determination. If you don't believe God determines all, they would say, therefore, you mean that God does not know all things, and therefore you don't even believe that God exists. So here is their reasoning. The reasoning is God foreknows the future. We have many passages about God foreknowing the future. One is Isaiah 46:10, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times, things which have not been done. So in other words, God can declare anything that's going to happen in any times. He knows all things, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. Also, if you think about prophets, what is to be the test of the prophet? That is, that the prophet can foretell the future because God knows the future. He knows all things. So the argument is established that the reason that God knows everything, the reason that God knows the end and the beginning, is because God established all events. He decreed them all. Therefore, we cannot have free will, because if we possessed free will, we would have the freedom to do something other than what God declared, which is impossible. Judas betrayed Jesus not because of anything in Judas, but because God decreed that Judas would betray Jesus, and because Judas, in his own sinfulness, desired to do what God had decreed. So God decreed all things, the end as well as the means. That's a phrase that they will often use. So if it appears that something aligns with the principle of free will, well, it just means that God determined the conditions, the instruments, and the arguments that will be used to bring about his predetermined results. So the basic argument is that God's knowledge of all things caused all things to occur. And different determinists will work this out in different ways. John Calvin, for instance, had God actively and intimately involved in every single thing throughout all of history. What we talked about last week with compatibilism, that would have no room in the thinking and reasoning of John Calvin. He probably taught what I would say is the hardest form of determination, that the reason everything happens, everything that every person thinks, is because God is actively willing. That's what I want that person to think. That's what I want that person to do. Everything is because of what God actively desires. There are others who would describe it this way, that God is the first mover. God spoke creation into existence, and the speaking of creation into existence, the forming of Adam as he did, the planting of all of the trees in the garden, including the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, made everything that would follow inevitable. So you could illustrate this idea of God's determining all things through dominoes. And that is, I guess I didn't put my dominoes picture up there. You could illustrate that through dominoes. God, in his knowledge, made this wonderful mosaic of dominoes throughout all of history. And it was his plan in the placement of every single block in that mosaic of dominoes. And when God knocked down the first block, when he spoke things into existence, then all of the rest of the dominoes would eventually fall as a result of the dominoes that God initially placed with his plan, and then the knocking down of the first domino. Therefore, when you believed in Jesus, or when you decided to eat a donut this morning, no matter what it was not you in your freedom making those decisions. It was instead you walking in line with the decree of God that was made before the foundation of the world, and then brought into reality in time based upon God's plan. So you had as much control over what you would decide to do as the next domino in that domino chain that was knocked down by God when he pushed over the very first block. Now, when we talk about the gospel and people believing in salvation, on the one hand, that doesn't sound that bad, that God determined all things and made it that we would believe the gospel. For a lot of people, that sounds totally right. As in, if this didn't happen and God didn't bring that person before me, how could I have ever believed without the working of God? The problem is that this decree and plan of God, according to determinists, covers every single thing that comes to pass. Therefore, when you placed your faith in Jesus, that was part of God's plan in eternity past. In the same way, if you screamed at your family in your worst moment of anger, or when you made that terrible, awful purchase that ruined your financial situation for years, those as well were part of God's plan and what he desired to have happen in your life. They would say if God knew all, therefore he must foreordain all. So if we have freedom to make our own decisions, then therefore God cannot be omniscient. He cannot know all things. Now, my response to that philosophical argument is based in a large part on the writings of Robert Piccirilli. So if you ever wanted to look more into this subject of free will and how our free will can fit with God knowing all of these things, I would suggest reading the books by Robert Piccirilli. I think he has an excellent way to take these philosophical arguments and bring them down to a level that's very easy for most everybody to understand. The first thing to note, though, about their view is that they make a fundamental error in their philosophy. They equate God's knowledge of the future with God's causation of the future. But knowledge does not equal causation. We can know something, past, present, or future, but that does not mean our knowledge of the future caused the future. We've been given no scriptural proof that God's knowledge is based only on what he will do or he will cause. In fact, there are numerous places in the Bible where God states that he knows something is going to happen, but that thing that God knows does not actually happen. So an example of this occurring is in the life of Hezekiah. God comes up to King Hezekiah, the king of Judah, and God says, Hezekiah, set your house in order, for you will die and not live. So God has knowledge that Hezekiah is sick, and the result of Hezekiah's sickness will be death. But then Hezekiah prays, and God answers in light of the prayer that Hezekiah made. God did a miracle so that a sickness that would naturally lead to Hezekiah's death doesn't lead to his death. Hezekiah continues to live. He lives another 15 years. So God had a knowledge that the sickness that Hezekiah would die would lead to death. But then the circumstances changed through Hezekiah's prayer and the Lord's own direct involvement. So God, knowing what would occur, and that is the sickness naturally leading to death, it didn't occur because God intervened and stopped that sickness from doing its natural path. So his knowledge of what that sickness would do did not happen. So in other words, God's knowledge was not causation of the death of Hezekiah in that instance in his life. Now, that story alone should cause the argument that God's foreknowledge means that God determines all things to crumble like a deck of cards, because their philosophical understanding of God's free will, removing our ability to have choice, is based on that simple understanding. But we still need, I think, spend a few more moments dealing with this idea of how can someone have free will if God already knows what a person is going to choose? If God knows what choice you're going to make, how can your choice really be true since God knows what is going to happen? Since God has omniscience, that should, according to those who follow this view, mean that our will is not truly free. And here's where immediately this is going to get a little complicated. Maybe some of you are sitting there being like, Shawn, this is already complicated. I'm trying to make this as easy as possible, but this is a little bit more difficult. And that is God's omniscience does not cause the future. God's omniscience makes the future certain. Two different things. So one is saying God's knowledge causes the future. The other is God's knowledge makes the future certain. So here's something that we all need to grasp with when it comes to the past, the present, and the future. And that is there's only one history of humanity. There's only one past, there's only one present, and there will only be one future. We are not living in the world of comic books. We are not living in the world of Back to the Future. No one is traveling back in time and making a different future than what would have been with other plans. There's only one timeline. So like my cell phone here. So I got my phone and I just dropped my phone on the floor. There is only one scenario where I will choose to drop my phone in the middle of this lesson. There will never be another scenario where I'm like, oh, it's my phone. Maybe I shouldn't drop it because I don't want it to break. No, I will always drop the phone in this scenario because there's only one timeline. And God knew the choice that I was going to make during this lesson. He knew that in order to illustrate how God knows the future, he knew I was going to pick up my cell phone and I was going to drop it on the ground. Now, God's knowledge that I would illustrate the future by dropping my cell phone on the ground did not cause me to drop my phone. It only meant that God knew the choice that I was going to make. And since God knew the choice that I was going to make, from his perspective, the future is certain. It is not caused, but it is certain. That's why God can tell prophecy, because he knows for certain what is going to happen. Now, this would make some people say, well, then our free will is stronger than God, because God knows our choices that we're going to make, and he can't change them. And so he's stuck being a servant to the choices that we're going to make since his knowledge can't be changed. Well, I would say not only does God know our choices and what we're going to do, but God also knows his choices and what he's going to do. So God also, one, knows that Hezekiah is going to get sick, and God knows Hezekiah is going to pray. God also knows how he will respond to Hezekiah's prayer. And it's God making the choice to respond to Hezekiah's prayer, not being trapped by what it is that Hezekiah would do. So God knows how we will freely think, decide, and act, and he also knows how he will freely think, decide, and act. So his hands aren't tied by our decisions. Instead, God has an infinite knowledge that allows him to act in such a way that the Lord always does exactly what he wants. And no matter what decisions we make, we can never come in a way that we will ruin the plans that he has for us and the plans that he has to one day have Jesus Christ rule. God does not need to determine our choices in order to accomplish his will. So as an illustration, let's go to the most common passage that's used in the Bible to support meticulous determinism, and that is Genesis 50:20. This is the most common view to support verse to support compatibilism or determinism. You have Joseph speaking to his brothers, discussing how God was working in his journey down to Egypt. Joseph says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." So what the meticulous determinist will come and say is, here is one of those special verses that tells us how we should interpret all of the Bible. This verse is allowing us to peek behind the curtain. And what we see is, it looked like Joseph's brothers were selling Joseph in envy and selling him into slavery out of spite. But it was really God who was selling Joseph into slavery in order to save many people. Both Joseph's brothers and God determined Joseph's slavery. That is compatibilism. Now, we need to be clear. We don't read that God decreed, planned, or ordained for Joseph to be unjustly sold into slavery. Instead, what we read is that God meant that slavery for good. God took their evil, God took the slavery and made good out of it. I like to use baseball to illustrate what Joseph is teaching us here. I think what we have with Joseph's brothers and God is a pitcher versus batter situation. And this is what always happens with men working evil and God working good. So when you have a game of baseball and it's the pitcher versus the batter, the pitcher is trying to throw the baseball in a way that he will strike out the batter. So the pitcher's throwing the ball to throw it past the hitter. The hitter, on the other hand, what is he trying to do when the pitcher pitches the ball? He's trying to hit it with the bat. So the it of Genesis 50:20, the slavery of Joseph's situation, that's similar to the pitcher throwing the pitch in baseball. The pitcher is throwing the ball to strike out the batter. That's the intent of the pitcher. The batter, on the other hand, he wants to hit the ball that the pitcher is throwing. That's his intent. In Genesis 50:20, God is the batter and Joseph's brothers are the pitcher. And Joseph's brothers, they tried to throw a curveball at the plans of God. God even told Joseph's brothers his plan. What was God's plan? I'm going to exalt Joseph, and you're all going to bow down before him. And Joseph's brothers are like, whoa, we're not going for those plans, Lord. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to take your servant, we're going to put him in a pit, and we're going to sell him into slavery. And let's see you try to bring him into a kingship doing that. So they throw this curveball at God's plans. What is God, as the batter, able to do with the curveball that Joseph's brothers threw at him? Not just hit it, he knocks it out of the park. The bases are loaded, grand slam. God delivers all of the people. So they tried to throw the curveball at God, and then God was able to turn on that curveball, knock it out of the park, and save Israel as a nation. Now, in a baseball game, when a batter hits a pitcher's pitch and knocks it out of the park, does the batter determine what pitch the pitcher threw? No, the pitcher gets to determine what pitch he threw. The pitcher can throw whatever he wants: curveball, fastball, changeup. Keep in mind, lots of different things that a pitcher can throw. So what we're saying here is that what Joseph is saying is, you tried to throw a curveball at God, but God took that curveball and he knocked it out of the park. And the curveball is that slavery. God did not need to determine the slavery. The passage isn't saying that God determined the slavery, just that God took that evil sin they did and then brought good out of it. He knocked a home run out of it. So just like the batter doesn't determine the pitcher's pitch, God does not need to determine the slavery, the evil that we do, in order to bring good out of it. Now, we've already covered two of the proof texts that are used to determine all things. This one in Genesis chapter 50, and then the first verse that we covered in Isaiah chapter 46, where it talks about God knowing all things. And I want to spend the rest of our time just marching through a few of the other proof texts that are used to show that God ordained all that comes to pass, in order to show none of them actually say that God ordained all that come to pass. I'm going to use all of my quotations from the English Standard Version, hopefully to show that the translation I'm using isn't biased, since these translators believe in meticulous determinism. So one verse that's used to declare this point that God determined all things is Job 23:13. But he is unchangeable, and who can turn him back? What he desires, that he does. So first, when it says God is unchangeable, it means he's of one mind. In other words, you can trust that when God is holy today, you know what God's going to be tomorrow? He's going to be holy. If God's going to be honest in this conversation, you know what you can trust him to do to be next conversation? To be honest. It means that he is unchanging in his character. And then the next verse just is simply God. The next part of the phrase is just simply God saying, whatever God wants to do, he does. So is this God saying that he determines everything? No, it's saying whatever God wants to do, he does. It's not saying that God does every single thing. And when you look at the list of proof texts that are brought up in order to defend meticulous determinism, the majority of these proof texts are saying exactly what Job 23:13 says, which is God does whatever he wants. Well, saying God does whatever he wants is not saying that God does everything. It's saying he does what he wants. Does God want to sin? No. So if someone's sinning, is that God doing it? No, because he doesn't want to do that. So that should actually be against meticulous determinism, but that's the, one of their most common, and there's several texts that basically teach that same thing, and we won't go over all of those this morning. The next is Proverbs 16:33, which says, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. So the argument of the determinist is very simple. If God determines something as small as the throw of dice, surely it must mean he determines everything. And at first glance, I can understand why they use this verse and why they think it is a strong claim, but they have one gigantic problem, and their gigantic problem is this is Proverbs. Proverbs is a book that was written to teach us how life typically works. And we could go through dozens of Proverbs that show us the purpose of this book is not to teach us universal truths such as God determines every single thing that happens. Another example from Proverbs is Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. So is this teaching us a universal truth that if we train our kids in the right way, we can guarantee that they're going to live the right way? No, it's not teaching that. It's saying, in general, if you train your kids the right way, they'll live the right way. It's not saying it's exclusively going to happen 100%. And the same thing with the casting of lots. This is saying, don't cast lots. Don't depend on what the pagan gods will do when you cast lots to determine what you should do. That's a bad way to determine the future, because at any point that God wants to, he can manipulate the dice however he wants to. So you can't depend on these pagan forms of worship in order to determine the future. And also, if you took the meticulous determinist viewpoint that every time you roll the dice, God is determining what numbers show up, then as Christians, we should be throwing dice in order to determine the future, because we would believe that every time we throw the dice, it is actually God telling us what he wants to do. And since we don't roll the dice, it's actually a form of us all saying, we know that this isn't how God determines the future, which then throws out the determinist argument for that verse. The next is Isaiah 14:26-27. I think the rest of these verses I'm probably not going to actually have on the screen for the text because they're a little long to fit. But Isaiah 14:26-27 reads, this is the plan devised against the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out against all the nations. For the Lord of hosts has planned, and who can frustrate it? And as for his outstretched hand, who can turn it back? So here we have Isaiah prophesying, saying he's got plans for Assyria. And the determinists will jump on and say, God made plans for everyone, and no one can frustrate his plans. Therefore, that everything that happens must be the plans of God. Everything is determined by God's plan. But again, we need to note that this is about God's plans for Assyria and how he will judge the Assyrian Empire in their pride. This is not about the plans that we're going to make for lunch this week. Second, it is also true that if God acts, if God chooses to do something, can anyone frustrate the actions of God? No, no one can frustrate the actions of God. That's one of the things you learn with Joseph and his brothers. They tried really hard to stop Joseph from being above them in authority. Did they succeed? No. Did God need to determine for them to send Joseph into slavery in order for that to happen? No, he did not. He just used that in order to dump on their own heads what they thought they would bring against God. So what Isaiah 14, 26 and 27 are saying is that in our sinfulness, people are going to try to thwart the plans of God. It looks like Assyria and all of their power at that time period, if anybody could thwart God's plans, it would be the Assyrian Empire. But not even they can stop the plan of God. If he determines for something to happen, it will happen. This is not saying that if someone sins, their sin must mean that God determined it. Next is Isaiah 46, 9 through 11, which says, "Remember the former things long past. For I'm God, and there is no other. I'm God, and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish my good pleasure. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my purpose from a far country. Truly I have spoken, truly I will bring it to pass. I have planned it, surely I will do it." So this is one of the clearest texts. We read a verse or two of this earlier, which said God knows everything. God is omniscient. This is what makes God stand apart from imaginary deities and demonic forces. He can tell the future as surely as he can tell the past. Since God knows all, it means that God knows everything that's going to happen. Whatever God wants to happen, whatever is God's good pleasure will occur. If God wanted to call a bird that was in Canada to have it fly all the way down to New Orleans, that bird will fly from Canada to New Orleans because that's God's plan. Whatever he brings to pass will occur. This is not saying that everything that occurs because God planned it. That's a very different thing. And so it's not making that statement. So again, most of these proof texts, what they end up ultimately saying is God can do whatever he wants. It's not saying that everything that happens because God wanted it to happen. This is also not saying that we don't have free choices in order to determine our own lives. And then our next is words of Jesus from the book of Matthew, Matthew 10, 28 to 29. "Do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul. But rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a cent, and yet not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father?" So the claim here is made, this is very similar to the casting of the lots, and that is whenever a sparrow dies, if a sparrow dies, it dies because of the will of God. Therefore, whenever anyone dies, it's God's will. Therefore, we need to trust that man's will can never override God's will, and God's will is covering every single thing that happens, so we're always living out the will of God. But Jesus here is not telling us that God has a predetermined ending point for every person's life, and we're just living out the story that God already wrote from us. But what it's telling us is that God knows and God is involved in every aspect of our life. This is where we should have confidence that God is involved in all of our lives, so we can trust him in the small things, we can trust him in the greater things, and also we need to be more concerned about God's judgment over our lives than anything else. This is not claiming that if someone persecutes the church, that person is persecuting the church according to the ordination of God. And if that was Jesus's point, I'm not sure it would be a comfort to say, oh, if someone's persecuting you, it's because God wanted them to persecute you. That would make me be like, I don't know if I could trust God if he's sending people to persecute me. The book of Acts, Acts 17, 26 to 27 says, this is Paul, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the faces of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way toward him. Yet, he is actually not far from each one of us. Now, this could stand up. This one and the next one in Ephesians, our last two. These are the most common of all the proof texts after that example that we saw in Genesis with Joseph. And in context, what Paul is teaching here is not that God determined all things. One of the reasons they love this verse is because it has the word determined in it. Like, oh, look, it's God determining everything. But Paul here is clearly teaching the Greeks that God is not the God of the Jews only. But what he's trying to teach these Greeks is that the God of the Jews is the creator God who divided all of the nations. So Paul's pointing back to Babel when God divided the languages, split up all the nations. He determined that there would be different nations, different boundaries, different nationalities. But one of the interesting things is that Paul, in talking about how God determined that there would be nations and people groups, all this happened at Babel. The interesting thing that God says is that one of God's purposes was that there would be a hope that they might feel their way toward him and find him. And that God isn't very far from each one of us. And this actually goes against the idea that God is picking people and judging them for hell and to send them away, because this is Paul actually saying to these Greeks, God's made the world in such a way that you're not far from the God of the Jews. You're close to him. You grope and you look, and you know what you'll end up doing? You'll find him. And isn't it amazing that God sent a preacher of Jesus Christ to these Greeks so that they could hear about him right now? So God's actually encouraging them to seek the Lord that they might find them. So this is beginning as a proof text for those who are reformed and believe that God determines who will and won't be saved. And it ends up showing that their belief is against what Paul says in Acts 17:27. And then our last verse is Ephesians 1:11, which says, in him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will. So this is the one that they probably love the most, because they say, see, look, God predetermined everything. God works all things according to the counsel of his will. Why does something happen? It's because God in his counsel willed that thing to happen. Now, again, like all of these proof texts, we got to put it in context. Like, what is Paul talking about here? The context that Paul is talking about is the eternal inheritance of the saints. And Paul is saying here that God has plans that every saint should receive something. And what is it, the one thing that every saint should receive? That is an eternal inheritance from God. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ, wonderful news. Not only were you adopted and brought into the family, but God has an eternal inheritance for you. And the purpose of the rest of Ephesians 1:11, talking about God predestining and God having a purpose and working all things according to the counsel of his will, the purpose of that is to say, you have an inheritance that is planned by God. And you know what it means when you have an inheritance planned by God? The stock market's never going to come and ruin that inheritance. You're never going to have a nation come in and attack your nation, and because of that, all of the laws that have been written, all the bank accounts are going to get wiped out because of that warfare. Your inheritance in God will never be destroyed. It is secured and guaranteed. God's going to work all things according to the counsel of his will to make sure that your inheritance is secure. It's such a wonderful thing. Like, if you just sit down and meditate on that for a moment, that in God's plans for eternity, a major part of God's plans is that the inheritance that his saints will receive, he's going to make sure that no matter what people do, they can't touch our inheritance in Jesus Christ. This is a wonderful, wonderful verse. But it is not saying that God is determining every choice that every person makes. It's God saying in his plan, he's going to ensure that nothing that's going to happen that will be outside of his counsel that will ruin the inheritance that we have in Jesus Christ. It is a great verse on the security of the saints in Jesus Christ, and not just our security, but also the inheritance that we will have in Jesus Christ. It doesn't mean that God ordains all things or plans all things, but he works out all things so that our inheritance will be secure in Jesus Christ. Now, an example of what I think Paul is saying here, it would be like if you were making plans to drive to Covington tomorrow. And you're like, okay, I got plans. I'm going to meet my friend in Covington for lunch tomorrow. But as you're going on your way to Covington, you get a flash on the news that there is fog over the Causeway Bridge. And the fog is so thick, they shut the bridge down. And all of a sudden, the bridge between you and Covington is closed. But you are going to determine to make it there no matter what. So even though fog has covered that bridge and you can't make it there, you're going to determine to get there. So what are you going to do? You're going to go east or you're going to go west instead of going straight north to get around there to get to your destination to be to your friend. So what God is saying here is that no matter what appears to come between you and your inheritance in Jesus Christ, God's already made plans for what's going to come between you and that inheritance. And he's making sure, according to his plans, that no matter what happens, you will end up receiving that inheritance in Jesus Christ. So God doesn't need to determine every single thing that happened for you to receive that inheritance. It just means that God's wise enough so that no matter what happens, you will end up receiving that inheritance. God doesn't ordain all, but he works it all for our good and for his glory. So those are the major proof texts for determinism. And our last lesson on humanity will be next week, as I want to talk about how free will and determinism relate to the gospel and us coming into relation with Jesus Christ. And that'll be the close of this series. And then after we look at that next week, we'll begin a new series and we'll walk through the book of Acts. So a big shift in changing gear. We'll get rid of this philosophy and systematic theology stuff, and we'll walk through the book of Acts. And so, next week will be Easter, so we actually we'll be eating breakfast at 9:00, and then 2 weeks the gospel, and then 3 weeks we'll look at Acts.